Hey everyone, James here from Italian Poliziotteschi and Jolly Reviews, here to review another Eurocrime film, Execution Squad, 1972. So this film is interesting. Should and why to watch this film? In my opinion, yes. In fact, I rarely bring on a film that, in my opinion, is not worth watching. So this film is definitely worth watching, and it's one of those films that is, I think, fairly well regarded domestically, at least when this genre is brought up. This is one of those films that people do know, but I think it's, once you're outside of Italy and you're talking about like top 10, top 20 Eurocrime Poliziotteschi films, this film I think falls beyond that. So it's one where I regard it high enough that I actually went and sought out the German Blu-ray, which I believe is one of the only ways to actually see it on physical media. It's also available on Tubi, and I've heard of some people having a YouTube link. So definitely one that you can seek out and see if you know where to look. About 1,100 people have seen this on Letterboxd, which is a lot more than I recall 4 or 5 years ago when I saw this film for the first time. This was a very successful film domestically. In fact, it's considered, along with Violent Professionals and High Crime, for being one of those films that weren't necessarily the very first, but were some of the first box office successes that really showed that there was something here. And they kind of kicked off that wave of like mass Poliziotteschi and Eurocrime films that would really come out throughout the 70s. And so, in contrast with something like Bird with the Crystal Plumage or Fistful of Dollars, those films are very, very well known, and perhaps some of that is because of the directors. Leone as well as Argento went on to do very canonized work. Poliziotteschi definitely a lesser well-known genre, and the director here, Steno, while he is, fairly well-known for his comedies in Italy, he's not on that same sort of level and certainly doesn't have that kind of international appeal. Nevertheless, I think this film is really interesting. I think it's worth watching because it combines a lot of familiar elements. If you've seen a lot of these Poliziotteschi and Eurocrime films, some of the social commentary, the cop that's sort of like frustrated with the system, a lot of a lot of kind of political unrest as well, combined with it's kind of some twists that you wouldn't necessarily expect, all the way down to the leading man. So we'll get more into that later. We'll definitely be spoiling this film. So if you don't want to be spoiled, stop the review now, go check the film out, and then come back and watch the rest of this. And it's an interesting companion piece to a number of films. First of all, with the High Crime and Violent Professionals, but also with kind of the Damiani films that came out before this. So something like Confessions of a Police Captain, really looking at the corruption that's just kind of like inherent and like literally built into the buildings in the case of Confessions of a Police Captain. So Steno is also known as Stefano Vanzina. That's his real name. He has a couple sons that ended up directing a couple of the kind of jolly in the 80s, Nothing Underneath and Too Beautiful to Die. Did they do both of them? I forget. But they did at least one of those films. This takes place right in the middle of the years of lead. And he's a director definitely more known for Italian comedy. And he talked about kind of deciding to direct this film. And part of it is he wrote it and then he kind of got ushered in to direct it because people wouldn't touch the material because it was fairly critical towards the police, which is interesting. I don't know that I suppose it is pretty critical of the police. I don't know if it really stands out as being like way more critical than some of the other ones, but it's definitely critical of the systems that are in place. And it also is kind of aggressively centrist in the way it does stuff in kind of an interesting way. Usually centrism is kind of like boring. It's like, oh, it's so moderate, it's middle of the road. But in this way, it kind of takes shots at both kind of like the extreme kind of left position as well as the right. And one of the things I get constantly annoyed with is like that we have to apply this sort of 2025 moral lens to films in order to enjoy them and appreciate it. Of course, the cultural, political topics aren't necessarily the same in 1970s Italy as they are now, but I think kind of interpreting it in a way that we have to agree with kind of the literal politics of the film in order to enjoy it. I think it's a very strange way to go about it, and it does baffle me how that has sometimes become the norm in sort of the discourse. I don't necessarily agree with all the politics of this film, but I think it's still interesting, and I appreciate that the film tackles it. If we would have believed certain commentators and whatnot, people would just take very, very safe choices, and of course these choices were made years and years ago. So I think this film is interesting in kind of its politics because I think it is unique. I think later on you would definitely have these cops, thinking of the Lenzi films as well as the Maurizio Merli films, where really have the cop that is the lone wolf fighting against the system, or fighting against criminals on his own, and really he just needs to take the law into his own hands. In my opinion, that's definitely, bordering pretty right-wing politics. Not that I agree with that at all. I enjoy those films too, but I think this film is definitely more interesting and a little bit more thoughtful when it comes to the political commentary. And I think a lot of this boils down to who we have as the lead. So we have a very well-known, domestically, Enrico Maria Salerno, who was popular. He was also a theatrical actor. So this is sort of like, in my opinion, when we have the action films and we have like action stars and whatnot. So your Franco Neros, your Luke Mirandas, people like that. And then you have the Zag. You have someone like a Liam Neeson coming in. And in my opinion, Salerno is kind of fulfilling that role as sort of like this more serious thespian. You see this guy, and he's definitely like middle-aged, late 40s, I think, maybe early 50s. And he's not really an action star type. And I think the film largely takes kind of after that personality. You're not going to see him doing things that like Franco Nero is doing in High Crime. So I think that's one way that this film really distinguishes itself, at least from the other two big ones. And I think it helps it to become a little bit less of a generic one, because I think in general the films tended to follow the trend of like High Crime, as well as Violent Professionals, where you have kind of these big action stars doing their thing, and I enjoy those films too. I think those films probably have better set pieces, not that this doesn't, but this is interesting because it kind of largely removes your main character from those set pieces too. And he also brings a certain sort of introspective attitude towards this. This film would be very, very different if you imagine Maurizio Merli or someone like that in the main role, who's just like shouting and basically is a force of nature. In this case, Salerno kind of initially leans into that kind of like, oh, the system's so screwed up, we have laws that are protecting the criminals and whatnot, and then the film kind of takes a hard left turn, and again, here we're getting into spoilers, and where it really becomes kind of magnum force. The Clint Eastwood Dirty Harry sequel, which I also enjoy quite a bit, where you have literal death squads made of former police officers, and it's really kind of this police vigilantism. And I think that's really interesting. And it shows kind of the undercurrent of kind of like the environment that you would need in order for you to be tempted to kind of move into this sort of fascism surveillance state. Of course, I don't take everything in this film like super, super literally, but I think it is very effective in kind of like showing that. And I think it works quite well as kind of like this 1970s paranoid thriller, where you have like people that are kind of instituting the police state, but you see the kind of the reasons why people would, be attracted to that. And indeed, it does kind of like go into public opinion where people are complaining about this. You even have criminals churning themselves in. So I think it's interesting how it kind of shows those two things. Meanwhile, our main police guy, played by Salerno, I forget what his name is in this film, is really kind of like stuck between these two hard places where he wants to enforce the law, but he also wants to do it in kind of a legal manner rather than the extra legal manner that ends up kind of taking place. So I find that the death squads that are shown in this film are really, really effectively shown. They're very cold. The scenes are very striking, especially from the get-go. And indeed, how the film ends, it's extremely, extremely cynical, where we have Salerno, who throughout the film is shown to be a fairly capable cop of doing things, just kind of like overwhelmed and shot down. And I think it's the sort of film that you would, the ending that you would really only see in kind of the 70s, certainly not dominant in kind of American films outside of the 70s. I think it's also cool how Steno kind of uses sort of the texture and talks about how like the privately this vigilante group is being funded, and it just really shows a compelling picture of society just kind of falling apart everywhere at the seams. That's kind of sums up what I think is great about this film. It's definitely one of my personal favorites, and I think one that kind of grows, especially if you like this social commentary. And again, you don't need to agree with social commentary in order for it to be good. You just have to find it compelling or interesting in some way, which I definitely think this film qualifies. If it doesn't show, I listened to a podcast covering this film where they didn't like it at all, and I thought, I was very uncompelled by some of the reasons they used for disliking the film. This is far from the most reactionary of the Poliziotteschi films, too. Another thing that really works in its favor, of course, the Italian settings, which are just phenomenal, as well as the score by Stelvio Cipriani. It's just a banging score in the way that these Italian composers were just cranking out, very routine in the 70s. Just a really, really classic. Love the score, gets me pumped up, and it just helps to kind of keep this propulsive pace going. And I think that in combination with Salerno is certainly enough to keep me interested here. A couple of the highlights. I already talked a little bit about the first execution and kind of goes into this execution montage, which I think is really, really chilling. I think the way that Steno directed the police and he lit the scenes to be kind of like desaturated and gray, I think it's really, really effective. And it just kind of shows the criminals through the criminals' point of view as they realize that they're not being abducted by the police and they're literally being executed. Let's see, there's at one point a bus ride where Salerno takes around a bunch of tourists to different sites and kind of shows them what is wrong with the system. I think that's interesting too. I think they're clearly talking about real Italian rules and regulations. Another scene that really stands out is there's this is one of the more mean-spirited scenes of the film where we have a hostage where the person that has taken the hostage just throws her down and she gets run over by a car and is really bloody. There's a hard cut in there that I think is very, very effective. And I think just the overall impact of the conclusion, which is, again, very cynical, and we just show the system, it being very, very difficult to go against the system, and even people that are fairly capable, like Salerno's character, are just not enough to do it. And it hints at perhaps Mario Adorf's character taking up sort of that mantle for it, but it doesn't conclude on a particularly hopeful note there. Well, in the movie, I'm going to give it to Steno. I think he was very, very effective in just kind of creating this film, and it's a little surprising that he's most well known for comedies, but nonetheless, good job by him. Going to give this film a 8.5 score. I think it's a really, really solid film, and I do strongly recommend people check it out. Let me know if you've seen it. Let me know what you think of it too. I think there's a lot of underrated gems in the Poliziotteschi genre, and I think this is definitely one of them. And I think the more you are familiar with kind of the Years of Lead, as well as Salerno and his presence, I kind of almost think of him as like Italian Tom Hanks or someone like that. Someone that's just, always has a certain amount of gravitas and class to them. And he's certainly not your Anthony Sabato or one of your American stars that's brought over. I think a big reason why this film isn't more well known is because it doesn't have that kind of big star that's going to suck you in. But I think Salerno is absolutely up to the task. I think he's a great actor. So thank you all for tuning in. I will see y'all next time. Cheers.